Welcome back, guys. Good morning slash afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Looks like this whole digital learning will go on until about April 30th, at least so far, so buckle up for it. But we're going to start phase 1 today. If you guys make sure that I hit 30 likes on this video, I'll do a giveaway. That's right, I said a giveaway. And you may ask, what will that giveaway be? I'll give away 2 short answers for our next quiz. So hit that thumbs up button and comment down below. But let's get into the notes for today. Reminder that Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman that is, had destroyed much of the South on the President Abraham Lincoln's order. Fields, homes, and livestock were all destroyed. What this meant was that there was going to be huge economic gaps within the South. Millions of people, if we fast forward to today, are currently working on keeping their jobs or slightly changing what that job is. Today, we're actually experiencing something really similar to what they did in the South back then, which is how do you keep that economic system going? For the South, agriculture was their economic system. So much of that had been wiped out, so they're going to have to find something new. Today, because of the virus that is going around, many different stores or malls or restaurants, many of the tertiary industries, which means service industries, that even includes people like me as a teacher, we're not allowed to meet face-to-face with people anymore, or at least not as much. So our jobs are changing. My job has become one that is very much online. If you guys, by the way, would like to do a Zoom session, comment down below so that I know you'd like to do that Zoom session. As we move on, the South would change governmentally. Just as it would change physically, they needed to completely change what was going on within the government. They had their own president. Yep, that's it. That's him. That's Jefferson Davis. But now they'd be switching back. They'd be going back to the old government which they had, which was the Constitution. I want to see if anybody knows, so feel free to look this up, but how many House seats did South Carolina have in 1860? First to comment, we'll get some extra points. Some of these states, so for example, Virginia left Congress. All of the southern states, they vacated their congressional seats, meaning that there wasn't anybody during the years of 1861 to 1865 in Congress for Virginia. There's wasn't any representative, no senators and no House member, and they didn't get those seats back. So part of the punishment was that they didn't get any representation for their state back until 1869. That's almost 4 years of no representation at all. The other big problem was one that needed to be discussed, which is who is going to fix the South's problem. Is it really the North that needs to fix the South's problem? Is it the South that has to fix their own problem? Who's responsible? Do you let state governments take over, or do you let the federal government take over? Once again, if we fast forward to today, due to the coronavirus, there's all sorts of different things that are being discussed about what should happen. What's the responsibility of the American government, of something like Trump, whereas what's the responsibility of the state governments? So that would be somebody like J.B. Pritzker. Also, I want to give you guys an example of what one of the major differences is between Italy and America as you look at the coronavirus cases. So America hasn't reached its peak yet. And we think that in the next 2 weeks, so sometime in the middle of April is when America is going to reach its peak, where it's going to get really bad. Just so you guys know, it's been bad enough in Italy. And tell me what you think of this right here, okay? Because this is kind of crazy, and I'm not making this up when I say it. In Italy, if you are over the age of 80 and you get the coronavirus, and it's a pretty severe case, anybody who gets the coronavirus, so what it does is it targets the lungs and it makes it hard to breathe. And when it becomes hard to breathe, they do this thing called intubating. They essentially stick a tube down your throat, and that tube helps breathe, helps your lungs breathe for you. It makes sure that your body gets oxygen, because your body completely shuts down if it doesn't have any oxygen. Your brain dies within a couple minutes without any oxygen, okay? So you have to be intubated. And that takes a ventilator, which is a special piece of medical equipment, okay? And in Italy right now, going back to what I was saying, if you are over the age of 80 and you have had or you have the coronavirus they won't give you a ventilator, meaning that you'll die. Do you guys think that's right or wrong? Essentially, they have a limited amount. Too many people have the virus, so they've said over the age of 80, you don't get it. They're thinking actually about changing that to 65. Let me know what you think down below, because that one is pretty fascinating to me. As we look at our phases of reconstruction, there's going to be several phases. It's not just like one process that happens. It actually changes and molds over time. The first phase is going to be known as presidential reconstruction. Now, just due to the title, you should easily be able to tell or have an idea of what's going on. No, you don't need to know all the ins and outs. You'll need to know some laws, but not all the laws or anything like that. You guys probably will be interested in some of the laws themselves. But the first phase is presidential reconstruction, so that obviously means that the president is going to be running this reconstruction. The ideas are going to be coming from him. The second phase, though, is congressional reconstruction. Congressional reconstruction, which means that no longer is the president in control, but Congress is in control. And it's really interesting to see the interaction between Andrew Johnson and the Congress during this time period. It's actually kind of crazy what happens with the president. And I'll bring up a point in just a second about that. And then the third is bourbon reconstruction. No, not bourbon, the whiskey, okay? Don't get all excited. It's not like all of America's getting wasted or drunk or anything like that. The word bourbon can actually mean reactionary. So it's kind of like how the South reacts to everything that's going on, which, by the way, was incredibly negative during this time period. All right, so on to phase one. As I mentioned before, it's all about the president, all about Andrew Johnson. He's probably one of the most infamous presidents. I kind of wanted to say the most infamous president, but that's all depending on who you ask. Some people might say JFK, some people might say President Trump, some people are going to say Richard Nixon, and others are going to say Andrew Johnson. So, I mean, it's really all over the place, but he's definitely, that is Andrew Johnson, considered one of the worst presidents of the United States. He wasn't the worst or necessarily a terrible politician, but from what I understand, he had this extreme temper where when people didn't get along with them, he just essentially insulted them. And, you know, presidents aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to have higher standards set, but that happens. And then he was possibly, maybe more than just possibly, a racist. And it's so hard to look during the late 1800s and 1900s at the situation that America was in, because they just weren't treating blacks equally, which is a shame and terrible, but that's just the way that it was, unfortunately. Thankfully, that'll get fixed much, much later during the second civil rights movement. But not all of Johnson's ideas were terrible. Now, obviously, Johnson was vice president while Abraham Lincoln was president, and Johnson actually wanted to bring the South easily and quickly back to being part of America, as opposed to being distant. He was trying to not sweep the Civil War under the rug, but there was just this really, really big fight. Obviously, we call it the Civil War, and so he kind of wants to bring America back together and keep America moving forward once again. And he would do this through what he would call his presidential pardons. Oops, excuse me, pardon me. Yeah, it's actually kind of like that pardon right there. Essentially what it means is, hey, we're going to forgive you for the crime of rebellion in this case, and you can become an American again. And his stipulation, meaning what he wanted to happen, was 10% of each of these states. So the states would join separately, each sold separately, but the states would join separately, and there'd be about 10% of their population. So we'll take South Carolina, for example. When South Carolina had 10% of their population agree that the war was their fault and agree that the Constitution was the ruling document, then they could be let back in. There were some exceptions to that, and we'll get there in a little bit. But that's for in a little bit. And Johnson had this desire to bring the North and the South together. But there was a group that believed that these rebels should suffer. After all, they were the rebels. They are the ones that caused this problem. And by the way, this is how many Southerners, or at least some Southerners, viewed teaming back up.
Join me, and I will complete your training. With our combined strength, we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy. I'll never join you. If you only knew the power of the dark side. Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No. I am your father. No. That's not true. That's impossible. Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
All right, now that I got that out of my system, these people were called the Radical Republicans, the ones that at least wanted the South to suffer. And really, one of the things that they were afraid of, the Radical Republicans, that is, as a group, is that there would be this massive influx of people in the South, aka the slaves becoming free, increasing the South's population. The more population that is in a state, the more representation they get in the government. If the South's population increases, their government power or control also increases. The end game for the Radical Republicans was to keep the Confederates out of Congress. They came up with their own plan. It's known as the Wade-Davis Bill. Instead of it being 10%, they wanted it to be 50%. And you might say, how did the South respond? This is how they responded.
No! No! No!
Now, this whole Wade-Davis Bill thing started when Lincoln was president, and Lincoln vetoed it. It also proposed that anyone who supported the Confederacy was banned from any lawmaking at all, banned from any legislation, which, by the way, that part actually carries out a little bit, especially with people like Jefferson Davis when he gets put up to be a senator later on, and people like Robert E. Lee never receiving their citizenship again. But here's a brief explanation of what vetoes are like, and the full video, there'll be a link in the description below.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History. Let's do it right now. Some government vocabulary.
Veto. I'm in your pocket, dude. Veto. Veto.
How about that? Let's hit him out of the park. Here we go. That's for learning. All right, in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, we bring to life kind of the concept that Madison laid out in Fed 47, which is that the president or the executive branch would have some type of partial agency role in the legislative process. And most of us understand that quite simply by the president being able to sign a bill, veto a bill, and then that bill, if it's vetoed, going back to the House that it originated from, where it would need a 2/3 majority in that House and the other House in order to override that veto and become law. So in Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2, there's a little phrase that talks about what happens after a bill gets passed by both houses of Congress. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excluded, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law, in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress, by their adjournment, prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. So what does all that mumbo-jumbo mean? Basically, it says that once that bill comes to the president's desk, the president has 4 options. A, they can sign it. They can make a big show of it. They can invite the TV cameras and get babies and kiss them and get a big magic pen and sign it. Everybody claps, and that's kind of, number 1, what they could do. Number 2, they can obviously send it back to the House that it came out of. Whether it started in the Senate or it was the House of Reps, it can go back there marked with a veto, usually with some type of explanation as to why the president's vetoing that piece of legislation. But then, if that House and then the other House can get a 2/3 majority vote, which is a super majority because it's so big, they can override the president's veto, right? So we're going back and forth in checks and balances. The third choice is to do nothing. The president maybe doesn't want to make a big show of it. Maybe they support it, but they don't want to alienate their base or some type of demographic group. So they just chill like a villain, man, right? Watch some football, play some pool, read a comic book, and then after 10 days, Sundays excluded, the bill just becomes law, magically. Like Jack and the Beanstalk, it grows into a law. And then the fourth option goes to the end of that passage, and this is the pocket veto. The president, if Congress adjourns itself and does nothing, if the president puts the bill in their pocket and forgets about it, after 10 days, if Congress is gone, if they've gone on adjournment, they've gone on recess, they're not in town, then the bill is dead. And then in order to revive that, when Congress comes back into session, they'd have to go through the whole kit, kat, and caboodle show again, passing it in the House and Senate. And basically that's almost impossible to do. So a pocket veto, and this has been challenged. In 1929, Calvin Coolidge, it was challenged, and the Supreme Court backed basically any kind of pocket veto. So even if Congress left just for a couple days, they know what they're doing. If it's, the calendar and the 10 days is up and they're not in town and the president doesn't do anything, they should have known better. In more recent times, Congress has been able to kind of designate an agent. And therefore, if they're out of town and the president wants to veto it, they can contact Congress. Congress can come back in town, and then they would be able to override that veto. In more recent times, the Supreme Court has kind of given it like a 3-day gig. So if you're out for a couple days on recess, the president can't use a pocket veto. But anything after 3 days, basically the president, if they want to use the pocket veto and, let that bill die in their pocket as Congress has adjourned itself, Congress should have known better. What are you doing? Why are you leaving town? We got a bill in the president's pocket. So that's a pocket veto. Maybe one example, especially if you're taking a test out there, you're in AP government or something like that. I always kind of think in my head of Lincoln and the Wade Davis bill. This goes to radical Reconstruction and Lincoln kind of being a little bit softer on Reconstruction. Go look at another video. But basically, Lincoln doesn't want to sign the bill, but he also doesn't want to alienate the Republican Party. It's his party. The radicals are in his party. He doesn't agree with them all the time. So instead of vetoing the bill, he waits till the radicals adjourn Congress and go home, and then he does nothing.
While all that jazz was going on, Lincoln bites a bullet. Well, I mean, okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that, okay? But either way, Johnson becomes president of the United States because Lincoln does get shot and dies, and we talked about that at the end of the chapter. And Johnson actually does have this kind of cool rags to riches story, especially for a person who becomes president of the United States. Johnson had no formal education. He was actually born in a log cabin, and his dad actually died when he was 3 years old, and his mom was a seamstress. So as Johnson was raised, he didn't go to school. Instead, he learned how to make clothing. And for males, we call that a tailor. Not the name tailor, but a tailor, somebody who creates that. He later moves and he gets married, and his wife is going to be the one that teaches him how to read, how to write, and how to do math. Now, no, don't go to your parents and be like, hey, mom and dad, I don't need reading, writing, or math, and I can become president of the United States. Just look at Andrew Johnson, because remember, Andrew Johnson was one of the more hated presidents. Yes, he was a president nonetheless, but that's hopefully not what you shoot or aim for. Johnson was a hard worker, and he establishes himself in his tailor business, and then he enters politics. And by the end of his political journey, he does become president of the United States. Johnson's plan, which was mostly based on Lincoln's plan, went a little bit like this. This was the idea or argument. Lincoln was incredibly logical. He wanted to be able to write things out, and he said it's impossible for states to secede because of what the Constitution says states are allowed to do. Only people can secede, which means we don't take away state representation. We only punish those who refuse to support the Constitution. So let's leave those states in Congress, and we can put people in those positions. So South Carolina and Virginia would have 2 senators. And this is really what that first phase is all about. So as we look at Andrew Johnson's plan, the first thing that he would do is he would give amnesty, and he'd give amnesty, meaning freedom or forgiveness, to all loyal Southerners except for those who were rich or led the Confederacy. Now, if you're wondering what happened to those people, they could be forgiven later if they wrote a personal letter to the president, but it was essentially whether the president wanted to or didn't want to. Now, the reason amnesty is incredibly important is because it lets people vote again, and it gives people the ability to have standing with the government, meaning that they can get their property back or they can own land. Now, it is important to understand, because I think today we're a little bit estranged from this idea of why voting is so important. You've got to remember that the American Revolution, which was fought 200 years before this, part of the reason, 100 years before this, part of the reason that it's going to happen like that, where why voting is so important to these Civil War time people, is because America fought for the ability to vote. They didn't necessarily fight for democracy at first, but that's what they established, and so that ability for them to vote became incredibly important to them. Unfortunately, Johnson didn't really have a favorable view towards black people, and we're going to deal with that a little bit more tomorrow. Towards the beginning of 1865, Congress passed what was known as the 13th Amendment. It was actually just before the war was over, and by the end of the year in December, this finally gets passed. I believe Georgia was one of the last states. I think South Carolina and Mississippi both refused to ratify it, which is actually going to be in the next blank, so I don't want to say that yet. Just okay, there we go. I rewound a little bit. But the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. It makes it illegal to have slaves. Now you're like, Mr. Dickinson, we're slaves in school. No, it's a little bit different. They actually brought that up as an argument in a court case, and the Supreme Court ruled against it. It wasn't during this time period, it was more modern, but I don't remember the name of that case, so I'm sorry I can't bring that up for you guys. But essentially the way that Johnson looked at this is he said, hey, you know what? You owe me one southern states because I'm helping you become part of the America again. Now, as I just mentioned, all the states except for Mississippi and South Carolina ratify this, which is really, really cool that all those states did, and it's unfortunate that those two states did not ratify it at this time period. And instead, what some or many of these southern states are going to do is actually come up with what are called black codes, which is what's going to be the pinnacle of our discussion tomorrow, and our talk tomorrow is, what were those black codes? These black codes turn into something that today we call the Jim Crow laws. Alright, I got to make sure I don't disappoint. Thank you guys for watching. Some of you have already mentioned this. If you'd like to, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Maybe consider subscribing. I mean, this is facetious, so you don't have to do this, but I felt pressured to. Okay, like and subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications so that you can be the first one to watch my videos, so that you can get a little bit of a better idea of what's going on and maybe earn yourself some bonus points. But have a great rest of your day or night, whichever one it is. You are dismissed.